Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. I'm here today with Professor Steve Saideman from Carleton University, and I figured we would talk a little bit about the defense minister because we had a motion in the House to censure him this week, which is mostly just for show, but the real underlying issue is that this is a minister who is damaged goods, and Steve's written a piece, I've written a piece, basically saying that it's time that this minister needs to resign. So I figured, as the guy who got the ball rolling, we would talk to Steve about this. So let's just, I guess, start with making the case as to why Sajjan needs to go.
Well, most simply put, he doesn't really understand what his job is. His job as the Minister of National Defense is to oversee the Chief of Defense Staff and to make sure that the Chief does things that are in line with what the Prime Minister has promised and what the government has promised as the stuff that they should be doing. And so when this government came into power, they had a big defense review, and the big defense review said, we're going to move the personnel section to the very first part of the document to demonstrate our commitment. Well, and so this is obviously a priority. They also, the Deschamps report came out, I think, shortly before this government came into power.
Before, yeah.
And they promised basically to follow through on it. And instead, what had happened is that John Vance, as chief CDS, was given, seems like, free reign to do what he wanted. And what he wanted to do was pretty much not do the Deschamps report. One of the key components of the Deschamps report was to say, we don't want to insist that every person who is a survivor or a victim of sexual misconduct has to report it, and it shouldn't be the case that anybody who observes it should have to report it. They should take seriously the concerns, the preferences of the survivor. And instead, John Vance put it together, duty to report, which was the exact opposite of this. If you see something, say something. And it eliminated discretion by everybody. So that's one example of the fact that the military, led by John Vance, was doing the opposite of what the civilians had promised. And so if they're not doing their job, then it's the job of the Minister of Defense to say, okay, John, you need to change course and do what we ask, or we can get rid of you because the CDS serves at the pleasure of the Prime Minister and the Defense Minister.
Yeah. And so, I think this is something that kind of has been, I guess, underappreciated throughout everything that's gone on, is just this reporting relationship between the CDS and the minister, and why that's important for the sake of parliamentary accountability.
Well, this is the thing that I've been puzzling over for about 10 or 12 years, because I had an interview in 2008, I want to say, with a member of parliament, and I was doing a different project, but it helped to create the current project, which is understanding how legislatures do or do not do oversight. And this parliamentarian said, we don't do oversight of the military. We hold the minister to account. And so it's not that. And when I interviewed John Vance a while back, and he said, I am not answerable. I'm not accountable to the parliament. I'm answerable to the parliament. And so that means that if they call him and the chief of defense staff shows up, they can ask him questions and he can answer if it doesn't involve classified, or if it doesn't involve advice to cabinet, which means pretty much nothing that's really relevant or interesting, can he talk about? And so the key mechanism for civilian control of the military in this country is the Minister of Defense controlling the Chief of Defense Staff. And one can either argue that Vance was doing exactly what Sajjan wanted, which was, oh man, Sajjan was wanting bad stuff, or Sajjan had no control over Vance. Vance was doing whatever he felt like, and then Sajjan wasn't doing his job. So either way, Sajjan wasn't doing what he was supposed to do as the guy responsible, as the politician responsible, as the key civilian in charge of civilian control of the military.
And it's that civilian control thing, I think, is also one of the components that I think we, even in the media, kind of fell down on around Sajjan when he was appointed, is the fact that he was still an active serving officer at the time, which really undermines the whole point of civilian control. implicated in the culture because he's steeped in it. And I think that that's something we kind of fell down on.
Yeah, I didn't really make a big stink of it at the time, but I made similar stinks when James Mattis was named, and then when Lloyd Austin was named in the United States. It's one thing to have, let's say, some parliamentarian or official who did a tour or two or three in the military long ago, and that they're not necessarily heavily socialized. They're not necessarily so hardwired, connected into the networks of the military that they can't have an independent outlook. But if you talk about someone who's been, rose to the level of, I believe it was a lieutenant colonel, who had, been there for, at least a dozen years. And I spent a year in the U.S. Joint Staff on a fellowship, and I've never been more thoroughly socialized in 1 year. I can't imagine what it's like over the course of 12 years, but any modern military spends a lot of its effort trying to get people in that organization, each other, to have a common doctrine, common perspective, and to see each other as brothers and sisters in arms. And so then it becomes very hard to take a person out of that context. Mm-hmm. And so in the United States, for instance, there was a rule that said you need to be out of the military for 7 years before you can become Secretary of Defense. But then they can have a waiver vote, and now they've waived it twice, which means that I'm not sure it'll ever matter again. But in Canada, it would make sense not to appoint people from the military to oversee the military. You need to have some distance. And people say, well, you need to have military experience to have the expertise. And it's like, well, there's oodles of expertise out there. Just tap into it. That's what the people in under the Minister of National Defense in the Department of National Defense, a lot of those people have military experience. There's a lot of expertise that you can get that does not require serving in the military. It's like the folks in sports who say you can't have a non-athlete be a commentator on sports because they don't know how to play the game. It's like, well, actually, you can do a whole lot of analysis of how things work, including, quantitative techniques, mm-hmm. big data, to see the forest for the trees, because a lot of the soldiers, sailors, aviators, or baseball players, catchers, pitchers, are trees, not forests. They have a very strong view of the tree they've been living with for the past however 20 years, but they may not really be able to see the forest for the trees.
And I think that's one of the things about the way Canadian cabinets work is that we don't insist on people, we don't generally insist on doctors being health ministers or so on, because it's the role is not to be the subject matter expert. The role is to be essentially the manager for the bureaucrats, and they're the experts. They're the ones who bring the advice, and it's for the ministers to kind of evaluate and act on that advice, as opposed to being the expert and determining policy top down. And I think we sometimes forget that in the way we look at cabinet constructions, particularly when we compare ourselves to Americans. Mm-hmm. But that's kind of my own thought here. The other thing I was just going to say was, in terms of putting former soldiers into defense minister positions, I always kind of go back to under the Conservatives, it was Gord, and suddenly I'm blanking on the last name. Anyway,
Connor.
Yeah, and basically he was a Cold War, one or two Leaf general, and early in the Afghanistan mission was basically trying to do Cold War management of the Afghan war, and I thought that was one of those kind of lessons that I don't know that we necessarily learned well enough.
Well, one of the other lessons is from that example and from the Sajjan example is one of the strange things about the military is they say, well, war is politics by the means. They go back to that basic foundational saying by Clausewitz way back when. But they insist, because they've read other stuff since then, that military should stay out of politics, which means that they don't develop political skills. And the thing is that there's a contradiction there, because militaries are always involved in politics. There's always, because politics is about making decisions, about making collective decisions.
Yeah. And
so you end up having generals who think that they should stay out of politics, they shouldn't think politically. And then when they retire, they are put in political positions. And it turns out they suck at politics. They suck at managing the media. They suck at trying to figure out how to balance competing points of view. They get rolled often by the military because the military actually does, there are plenty of bureaucratic actors who know how to play things really well. Mm-hmm. And so O'Connor didn't really know how to handle Hillier, even though he was his superior. And Sajjan made some really big political mistakes in all of this, right? So he said, the reason why I started calling for his head essentially was he said in the parliamentary, in front of the Defense Committee, he said that investigating Vance would be politicizing the thing and it's not his job. And I was like, your job is to oversee this guy. And so you want to know as much as you can about this guy. So that way you can figure out whether you should keep him around. Because again, the idea of the Chief of Defense Staff is he serves at the pleasure of the Prime Minister and the Defense Minister. And when he becomes a liability, a political liability, you get rid of him. Yeah. And the thing about the Vance story is Vance had been there for 3 years when this sexual misconduct thing came up. Yeah. And even though he had a prior history that was problematic, it was really this one story of 2018. And the thing is, he had been there for 3 years. That was about the average length of a successful CDS term. Mm-hmm. And so they could have said, well, this might be something that might be problematic down the road. Why don't we get rid of him now? We could just say he's done a great job, move on from him. Nobody necessarily has to be the wiser about Vance having any troublesome record. You just say, General, you served your 3 years, you did an honorable job, time to go. Yeah. And then move on. And it would have been easy. It would have been politically painless. And then they could have found somebody else to do the job. And so that was one big problem that Sajjan made, was not getting rid of Vance when it was easy. And then the second problem, of course, is he named a guy to replace Vance who had a checkered record. And it was not, the fact that these things came up within weeks. Yeah. These are not things that were deeply buried. These things were widely known within the military. I'm not sure how much McDonald's thing was widely known, but I think it was not so hidden. Vance's record was widely known. And to get back to another problem, which we should talk about, is one of the strange things about Canadian civ-mil relations is that the Chief Defense Staff gets to pick his entire command staff. So all the 3-star or 3-leaf officers who run the major roles are picked by the Chief Defense Staff. So, if you had a danger of an old boys club, then this is the perfect recipe for having that old boys club be renewed year in and year out. Yeah. And you would think that one of the things that the Chief Defense, that the Minister of National Defense would do is make sure that they pick good people for that. And so while it's the Chief of Defense Staff's responsibility, again, this comes to oversight, which is that the Minister of National Defense should be going, oh, you picked a guy whose nickname was Mulligan Man for skating through previous accusations of sexual misconduct to run the personnel branch of the military, whose job it is to make sure that we treat this issue seriously and take care of its survivors. Is there a problem with that, John? Why did you choose this guy? And so that by itself was a fireable offense for Sajjan, that he did not do his job, again, on one of the most important salient issues in all of the Canadian military. This has been a hot issue, since 2015. And this is actually a common problem, that is sexual misconduct in the military. Mm-hmm. But it's also a common problem that gets a lot of action, a lot of heat, because many citizens don't really care about oversight over the armed forces, not just in Canada, but among the world's democracies. Yeah. But one of the issues they care about is personnel. Are you treating the folks who are willing to lay down their lives for us well? Are you creating a good environment for them? And partly because people have relatives who do that, and partly because we have a responsibility to help to take care of those who are putting their lives in harm's way for us. Mm-hmm. And so it's not just Canada that has this sexual harassment, sexual misconduct problem. It's not just Canada that has this abuse of power problem. But issue, I'm going to make sure that when Vance appoints people to be the head of personnel, we got to make sure this person's good. Yeah. And so Sajjan didn't do that. He appointed a succeeding CDS who had his own problems. And so as a result, we get other people caught up in this. The Danny Fortin story the past week. Mm-hmm. We don't really know what he did or, what he's accused of, but rumors are it's something that happened 30 years ago and was a fairly minor infraction. But now they have to treat it as seriously as everything else because they've already butchered every other possibility along the way. And had they managed those other files right, they could have had the credibility to say, we know we're looking into it, but our initial study suggests it's not that serious, and Fortan is doing a really good job, and it's not like he's has much opportunity here to abuse the personnel around the public health authority, the agency. So you could have treated this with more subtlety. So now they're at risk of a lawsuit. Well, not they're facing a lawsuit.
Yeah,
and that's not a whole lot of fun. So it's just the political malpractice. It's not just military, but he's caused his own government to face real repercussions for the fact that they're doing a lousy job of being the.
Yeah.
Sorry for the rant.
Yeah, no, it's okay. And I guess just my last point or question on this is, given that we are kind of in this state in Canada right now where we are kind of having a real moment of crisis in terms of dealing with this in our military.
Yeah.
Are we ahead of other countries in actually tackling this problem, or are we behind? Are we somewhere in the middle? Because I don't hear these same kinds of stories happening like with high level resignations and so on in other countries or other comparable countries.
I think it's a really good question. The reality is that the British and Australians are working on the same problem at the same time. And by the same problem, the twofold ones: civilian oversight of the military, what's the role of Parliament, and on the sexual misconduct front. The United States has had Congress people on this issue for quite some time. The senator from New York, Kristen Gillibrand, has made this her cardinal issue. Of course, the United States has its own bad politics because she was too busy campaigning for a failed presidential campaign in Iowa when I believe it was a vice chief the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff was the person nominated for that job, General Hyten, came under some question about whether he should have that role, given that he had been accused of sexual harassment. So we're not the only country that has, politicians looking, in their legislature doing the wrong, not paying serious enough attention to this or not handling it well. But are we ahead or behind? I think we're behind now because we did this report 5 years ago and we didn't implement it. And so that puts us a little bit behind the countries that we compare ourselves to. And the fact that we have so many senior officers being implicated puts us ahead in the competition for, worst abuse of conduct, worst abuse of power scandal. I don't think anybody else has lost their chairman in quite some time or their chief of defense staff on these kinds of issues. So, yeah, I think we're in worse shape.
Okay. And one last thing I wanted to just broach before we end today was we had an issue this week in Parliament where the Conservatives decided to pull their members from the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians, which is a group of parliamentarians, MPs, and senators who report to the Prime Minister in order to be able to review national security documents. This has been an ongoing thing with the firings from the Winnipeg lab. Viewers will have seen my interview with Dylan Robertson on this a couple of weeks ago. But I just kind of wanted to get your thoughts on this notion about where we're sitting in terms of our ability to review these oversight, these kinds of documents, or have this kind of oversight over national security in Canada.
Yeah, it's been fun to watch my two colleagues take different positions on this on Twitter. Stephanie Carvin has trained in law and national security oversight and looks more at it from an intelligence perspective. And Phil Lagasse has been studying the Crown for years. And Phil and I and a friend of mine, Dave Arswald, are working on a book project comparing the world's democracies and how their legislatures oversee their militaries. And so this is tricky because NISCOP, I guess, I don't know how to pronounce that.
I usually say NSI COP, but
NSI COP is the best we got, but it's a compromise, right?
Yeah.
So what we should have is a thoroughly empowered defense committee, one that has security clearances and has staff with security clearances, so that way they can get the documents and they can vet they can look at them on a regular basis, and so that way our defense committee is informed. As I said before, most of the conversations where they bring the chief defense staff out to talk, they can't really talk about anything because either everything's classified or everything's advice to cabinet.
Yeah.
And so if you had a defense committee that actually had security clearances, then they could ask questions and they could actually be in the know. And when you talk to parliamentarians about that, they say, we don't want that because if we learn stuff, then we can't talk about it because it's all covered by secret sauce. And the thing is, yeah, they want to be able to talk about things in question period because they don't really have any power in committee.
Yeah.
In other countries, those committees have powers. They can reallocate money. They might be in the process for how to get people promoted. For instance, in the United States, if you want to move up the chain of command from a colonel to a one-star general, if you want to move up from a captain to an admiral, you need to have the Senate approve you, confirm you, which means that the Senate Armed Services Committee is given the responsibility for doing all the work on that. And so that committee matters. And so the most nervous I ever saw military officers in my year in the Pentagon was when they were testifying to Congress. Our parliament, even if they had knowledge, they don't have teeth. And so I understand a little bit why they would say that. It's also because of pesky people like you and Sisterin, which is, the action is in question period, and it's not, you're not covering how well things.
No, I think you froze there.
Studying these issues, then the Defense Committee, the Committee on Women, came out with a report this week that's actually, I think, really good. I'll have to take a closer look at it. But it was actually substantive about, okay, here are the reforms we need. Whereas the Defense Committee became mostly about how do we nail people closest to the prime minister on this, which doesn't really lead to better policy.
Yeah.
So I understand why the parliamentarians don't really want to have more power because they would give them more responsibility. The Spider-Man principle or the Ben Parker principle. Yeah. And I mean, that was the punchline of Lagasse's piece today. He wrote another piece explaining where things stand. And if you give a parliamentary committee power, then they have to use it responsibly. And that's a question whether they would do so or not. And so we can feel pretty confident that they might not in this country because, as people have been talking about lately, our politicians are immature.
They are indeed. All right. And on that note, thanks so much for doing this. It was a great conversation, and hopefully we'll do it again in the future.
My pleasure. I'm always here.
All right. Thanks.
Thank you.
And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. That's at Journo_Dale on Twitter. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.